Now it's my pleasure to welcome Reverend Paul Johnson, who will be speaking with us today with a little assistance on Emily Dickinson.
Thank you, Beth. And Beth will be our Emily this morning. As my offering for Women's History Month, I'd like to speak this morning with the assistance of Beth on Emily Dickinson. She was born in 1830 and was a contemporary of Henry David Thoreau, Thomas Starr King, Abraham Lincoln, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Julia Ward Howe, and Emily Bronte, among other luminaries. But it has been said that her life could be summed up in 3 lines.
Born in Amherst, lived in Amherst, died in Amherst.
This is, in fact, an accurate description, except for a year as a teenager at Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, a summer visit to her father, who was a senator in Washington, D.C., and 2 visits to Boston for eye treatments. She appears to have lived her entire life from 1830 to 1886 in Amherst, and she spent her time wandering the family estate with her beloved dog, gardening, knitting, making bread, baking pudding, reading in the study, carrying on correspondence with people outside her family, developing a rich fantasy life, and composing poetry. For a number of years, she took care of her invalid mother. Her neighbors thought that she was quite odd. She always dressed in white. She seldom left her family estate and garden. She very seldom spoke to others. Her life of solitude was a conscious decision. She wrote,
"The soul selects her own society, then shuts the door. On her divine majority, obtrude no more."
Some have suggested she was bitter over a painful love affair, and there are some letters that suggest this. We don't know for sure. We do know that poetry became her lover. Poetry, in fact, became her life. She wrote,
"I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose, more numerous of windows, superior of doors, of chambers as the cedars, impregnable of eye, and for an everlasting roof, the gables of the sky. Of visitors the fairest, for occupation this, the spreading wide my narrow hands to gather paradise."
Only 10 of her poems were published during her lifetime. Isn't that amazing? And more than 1,800 of them were discovered by her sister after her death. And they are magnificent poetry, I believe. I've read most all of them. Not expansive as was the poetry of Walt Whitman, but rather terse and to the point. She did not develop a comprehensive philosophy of life, but her words encapsulated just aspects of existence on love and nature and immortality and beauty and death, despair and loneliness. She was fascinated by the sheer fact of existence and caught masterfully moments of ecstasy, moments of doubt, moments of despair. At times, they are clearly common, everyday moments.
"A bird came down the walk. He did not know I saw. He bit an angleworm in halves and ate the fellow raw. And then he drank a dew from a convenient grass, and then he hopped sideways to the wall to eat the beetle pan."
She speaks of the ecstatic experience of nature.
"I taste a liquor never brewed, from tankards scooped in pearl. Not all the vats upon the Rhine yield such an alcohol. Inebriated of air am I, and debauchery of dew, reeling through the endless summer days from inns of molten blue. When landlords turn the drunken me out of Foxglove's door, when butterflies announce their drams, I shall but drink no more. Till seraphs string their snowy hats and saints to windows run to see the little tippler leaning against the sun.
There are spots of humor in her poetry.
To make a prairie, it takes a clover and one bee, one clover and a bee, and revelry. The revelry alone will do if bees are few. How dreary to be somebody, how public like a frog, to tell your name the livelong day to an admiring hog.
Even in matters of religion.
Faith is a fine invention for gentlemen who see, but microscopes are prudent in an emergency.
In correspondence with Unitarian minister Thomas Dickinson, she seeks his advice on some of her poetry, and it notes that my business is circumference. And the term circumference comes from an essay by Ralph Waldo Emerson. He entitled that essay Circles, in which he claims there is no circumference to the soul, that there is nothing to hamper the growth of one's soul toward unknown circles of being and knowing, should one possess the courage to experience fully the revelations of each new hour. And she expresses this in lines of poetry.
Circumference, thou bride of awe, possessing thou shalt be, possessed by every hallowed night that dares to covet thee.
In Emerson and in Dickinson, circumference marks the end of definition and the beginning of risk. To Higginson, she wrote, I would like to learn. Could you tell me how to grow? Or is it unconveyed, like melody or witchcraft? Early in her letter, she had noted that her mother did not care for thought, and her father was too busy to notice what she did or thought. She allows herself to think and feel, to grow without circumference, to wherever the experience will take her. She experiences the perfection or full maturity of pain, and she expresses the perfection of joy. She accepts where her experience is leading her. She does not repress joy or sorrow. In one of her poems, she asserts it might be lonelier without the loneliness, because the loneliness has become a character, almost a person in her life. Allowing all things to go to their natural perfection or end does, of course, involve death. Death is the end of the line for all of us. She regularly rehearsed her own death. In one poem on death, she asserts, I made my soul familiar with her extremity, that at the last it should not be a novel agony. She has several other poems regarding death.
My life closed twice before its close. It yet remains to see if immortality unveils a third event for me. So huge, so hopeless to conceive, as those that twice befell, parting is all we know of heaven and all we need of hell.
Another poem on loss goes like this.
I never lost as much but twice, and that was in the soul. Twice have I stood a beggar before the doors of God. Angels twice descending reimbursed my store. Burglar, banker, father, I am poor once more.
In one poem, Emily goes behind a dying eye to become the person who is dying. The irreverent buzzing of a great blue fly shuts out the final light.
I heard a fly buzz when I died. The stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm. The eyes around have wrung them dry, and breasts were gathered firm, for that last onset when the king be witnessed in the room. I willed my keepsakes signed away, what portion of me be assignable, and then it was, there interposed a fly, with blue uncertain stumbling buzz between the light and me. And then the windows failed, and then I could not see to see.
Of pain, she wrote this.
Pain has an element of blank. It cannot recollect when it began, or if there were a time when it was not. It has no future but itself. Its infinite contain its past. It's enlightened to perceive new periods of pain.
Concerning the experience of losing control of one's mind, she wrote,
I felt a cleavage in my mind as if my brain had split. I tried to match it seam by seam, but could not make it fit. The thought behind I strove to join unto the thought before, but sequence raveled out of reach like balls upon a floor.
Yes, despair, death, loneliness, agony seem to be at the center of much of her poetry. It is certain she lacks the conventional religious faith of 19th century New England. Such a lack of faith may have been due to the hardness of the Calvinism of her time, and her family was from a Calvinist tradition. She desperately wanted to know and experience being saved. That was a characteristic religious experience of her time, but it never came. She never joined a church. There is evidence that this was one of the most fundamental disappointments of her life, especially during the year that she spent in the Mount Holyoke Female Seminary. We know that she admired much of the transcendentalist thought of Emerson and Theodore Parker, though she felt that Emerson was a bit too optimistic. But her attempts at resolution of doubt, at times to me, seem trite and feeble compared to the magnificence of much of her poetry. But one of the best known goes like this.
I never saw a moon. I never saw a sea. Yet know I how the heather looks and what a willow be. I never spoke with God, nor visited in heaven. Yes, certain am I of the spot, as if a chart were given.
Or,
I hope the Father in the skies will lift his little girl, old-fashioned, naughty, everything, over the stile of pearl.
I somehow wonder if these poems reflect the position that she usually held, because so much of her poetry leaves us with questions. A question mark, a huge question mark about heaven, about the meaning of life and the meaning of death.
I reason earth is short and anguish absolute, and many hurt, but what of that? I reason we could die. The best vitality cannot excel decay. But what of that? I reason that in heaven, somehow it will be even, some new equation given. But what of that?
At the age of 56, she died, having known more solitude than Thoreau and more pain than Emerson. She was buried in Amherst without friends or without ceremony. What is her legacy to us? She was, of course, a masterful poet. Her perceptions are keen and her vision is sharp. Her conceptions and her constructions are exquisite, I believe. But much of her poetry functions as Rorschach. It gives you images you can invest with your own meanings. I want to say to her, Emily, don't stay cooped up with your thoughts. Get out, meet people, socialize. Of course, she was told this many times by many people. When she was asked by Unitarian minister Dickinson if she, quote, never felt the want of employment, never going off the place and never seen any visitor, end quote, she answered, end quote, and this is amazing, I never thought of conceiving that I could ever have the slightest approach to such a want in all my future time. I realize I can't place my psyche upon her, but I must say that I have lived for periods of time in my life in deep introspection, looking inward, carrying on an interior dialogue, It's my belief that for mental and spiritual health, for proper balance, I must complement my interior life with dialogue and relationships with other people. It seems to me that melancholy, loneliness, and emphasis upon death in her poetry demonstrates that she might have wanted to hang on to her miseries. No, know that for sure, but I sometimes wonder if that was the case. And I want to say to her, some pain may be good for the soul, but enough is enough, Emily. One of her poems that has hooked me for several years is this one.
For each ecstatic instant, we must an anguish pay, in keen and quivering ratio to the ecstasy. For each beloved hour, sharp pittance of years, bitter contested for things, and coffers heaped with tears.
I believe there's some truth to that in keen and quivering ratio. For instance, when we love deeply and we lose the object of our love, in some way, our grief will be greater than if we had never loved at all, right? There's a part of me, a deep part of me, that supposes she's right, that somehow our pleasure and pain even out. There's some truth to the fact that our pleasures lead to pain, or the pleasures of some people lead to pain. The delights of tobacco and cholesterol-laden foods often lead to pain, right? But I remember once, in one of my former congregations, a parishioner came to talk with me, and he said, things are going so well in my life, my health, my business, my family. I just feel that something bad is about to happen. Mm. Upon reflection, I just don't buy Emily Dickinson's assertion that we pay for our pleasures in keen and quivering ratio. I believe she was ultimately a skeptic. Her best poetry often ends with a question mark regarding the meaning of life, but she always stayed a step away from ultimate despair. She accepted herself, saying,
I am glad that one is oneself and not somebody else.
She accepted the simple gifts of life.
An altered look about the hills, a wider sunrise in the dawn, a deeper twilight on the lawn, a purple finger on the slope, a flippant fly upon the pane, a spider at his trade again, an added strut in chanticleer, a flower expected everywhere, an axe shrill in the woods, time outdoors on untraveled roads. All this and more I cannot tell. A furtive look you know as well. And Nicodemus mystery receives its annual reply.
And she was able on occasion to affirm life.
To be alive is power, existence in itself without a further function, omnipotence enough. To be alive and well, 'tis able as a God, the maker of ourselves be what? Such being, finitude.
Yes, I must say I look for religious affirmation from Emily. I want her to tie her life together, and that's the meaning of the word religio, to bind together. But I don't see it in so many words, and this distresses me. She doesn't give firm direction, as noted in one of her best poems that I often think of.
Success in circuit lies, too bright for our infirm delight. The truth's superb surprise, as lightning to the children ease with explanation kind. The truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind.
The truth must dazzle gradually. Isn't that a masterful phrase? I cannot help but think of her as a Moses figure, leading us through 40 years of the wilderness, but never being permitted herself to enter the promised land. I cannot help but think of the great imperative which Moses gave the children of Israel. Behold, I have set before you this day both life and death. Therefore, choose life. And I think her, probably her most famous poem, encourages us. Hope is a thing with feathers, that perches in the soul and sings the tunes without the words and never stops at all. May hope be with us. So may it be.